The sun was just beginning to rise over the sprawling expanse of the African savanna, its golden light illuminating the dry, dusty road that cut through the heart of the wildlife reserve. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of dew and wild grasses, but the world was still and quiet save for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Towering acacia trees lined the path, their shadows stretching long and dark across the road. It was a scene of serene beauty, untouched by human chaos. Yet, in the middle of this peaceful landscape, a child's cries shattered the silence. A little boy, no older than 3, sat hunched on the road, his small frame dwarfed by the vast wilderness around him. His tiny hands clutched the hood of his oversized blue jacket, which hung loosely around his thin shoulders. Tears streamed down his cheeks, carving paths through the dust smeared on his face. His sobs were loud but trembled with fear, as though he sensed the dangers that lurked in the wild. The child looked around helplessly, his swollen red eyes searching for something or someone. But there was no one. Just the empty road stretching endlessly in both directions and the imposing wilderness beyond it. Unbeknownst to the boy, he was not entirely alone. On a distant ridge, a solitary figure moved gracefully through the tall grasses, its golden mane catching the early morning sunlight. Kovu, a powerful male lion, was known throughout the reserve as the King of the Ridge. His muscular frame and piercing amber eyes made him a formidable presence. Though solitary by nature, Kovu had carved out a reputation as a fearsome protector, guarding his territory with an intensity that left challengers trembling. Kovu's past, however, was not typical of a wild lion. As a cub, he had been rescued by a ranger named Lucas after his pride was decimated by poachers. Raised by human hands before being reintegrated into the wild, Kovu carried with him a unique connection to humans, a mix of trust and wariness that set him apart from others of his kind. This morning, Kovu was restless. The dawn, usually a time for him to stalk prey or patrol his territory, felt different. Something had disturbed the natural order. As he padded along a game trail, his ears twitched, picking up a sound carried by the wind. It was faint at first, barely noticeable amidst the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. But as the sound grew louder, Kovu's instincts sharpened. It was the unmistakable sound of crying. Kovu froze, his large paws sinking slightly into the soft earth beneath him. His ears swiveled forward, honing in on the sound. A low, rumbling growl escaped his throat, not one of aggression, but of confusion. In his years of roaming the reserve, Kovu had encountered many things: rival lions, wandering elephants, and the occasional vehicle carrying rangers or tourists. But this sound was unlike anything he'd heard before. Cautiously, Kovu turned toward the source of the noise. His powerful frame moved silently through the grasses, each step measured and deliberate. The crying was intermittent now, as if whoever or whatever was making the noise was struggling to catch their breath. The closer Kovu got, the more his senses sharpened. The scent on the breeze was unfamiliar, but distinctly human. It triggered a memory buried deep within him, a flash of his cubhood, of warm hands and the gentle voice of the ranger who had saved him. Kovu emerged from the tall grass onto the dusty road, his amber eyes scanning the horizon. And then he saw him. The boy sat in the middle of the road, his back to Kovu, completely unaware of the lion's presence. The child's cries were softer now, reduced to hiccuping sobs as he wiped at his tear-streaked face with small, dirty hands. Kovu's head tilted slightly as he observed the boy, his sharp gaze assessing the situation. This was no ordinary encounter. The lion's natural instincts, ones that demanded he see any human as a threat or potential prey, were tempered by something deeper, something almost familiar. The boy turned slightly, and for the first time, their eyes met. The child froze, his wide, tear-filled eyes locking onto the towering predator standing just a few feet away. Kovu's imposing frame was backlit by the rising sun, his mane glowing like a golden crown. The lion took a single step forward, his muscles rippling under his tawny fur. The boy whimpered, his tiny body trembling as he clutched the edge of his jacket. Kovu's tail flicked once, his amber eyes narrowing. He began to pace, circling the boy with a slow, deliberate stride. His nose twitched, taking in the child's scent. There was no fear in his movements, no aggression, only curiosity and something almost protective. The boy's cries subsided into soft whimpers as he watched the lion. Despite his terror, there was a strange calmness in the air, as though Kovu's presence carried a silent assurance that he meant no harm. Suddenly, Kovu stopped. His ears flattened slightly and his gaze shifted beyond the boy. A low growl rumbled in his throat. The lion's body tensed, his hackles rising. Something was wrong. Kovu sniffed the air again, his senses now fully alert. The child turned his head slightly, as if sensing the change in the lion's demeanor, but he didn't understand. Kovu let out a sharp, guttural roar that echoed across the savannah, a sound that silenced even the distant birds. The boy clamped his hands over his ears, his face scrunching in fear. And then, with a speed and grace that defied his massive size, Kovu moved. Whatever was out there, Kovu had sensed it, and he wasn't about to let it get to the boy. Kovu crouched low in the grass, his golden mane brushing against the tall blades as he observed the child from a distance. The boy's cries echoed softly in the morning air, each sob pulling at Kovu in a way that defied explanation. This wasn't prey. The child was too small, too fragile. But the sound, so unfamiliar yet so desperate, stirred something deep within him. The lion's instincts warred within him. A predator by nature, Kovu's first reaction should have been to assess the boy as a potential threat or meal. Yet, as he watched the trembling figure, another instinct took hold. A strange pull, one he hadn't felt since he was a cub. Step by step, Kovu advanced, his massive paws pressing silently into the earth. His body was a study in precision, every movement deliberate and cautious. The boy remained oblivious to the lion's approach, his sobs muffled as he buried his face in his tiny hands. When Kovu reached the edge of the road, he stopped. The boy sat just a few feet away, his back turned, his small shoulders rising and falling with each shaky breath. Kovu tilted his head, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied the child. The boy stirred. Perhaps it was the subtle rustle of grass or the faint scent of the lion on the wind that alerted him, but the child slowly turned his head. His red, tear-streaked face froze as his gaze met Kovu's. The cries stopped. A single moment stretched into eternity as the boy and the lion locked eyes. Fear flickered across the boy's face, his lips parting as though to scream, but no sound came. Kovu's amber eyes bore into him, unblinking, unreadable. The lion's tail flicked once, a quick, sharp motion that betrayed his uncertainty. He began to pace, his massive body moving in a slow, deliberate circle around the boy. His movements were fluid, yet tense, his muscles rippling beneath his tawny coat. The boy watched him, his tiny chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. His hands gripped the edge of his jacket, the fabric crumpling in his fists. Kovu paused mid-step, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The boy's scent was unlike anything he had encountered in the wild, tinged with salt from his tears and something faintly sweet, perhaps from the remnants of food clinging to his clothes. The lion resumed his pacing, his tail swishing low behind him. He kept his distance, though his eyes never strayed from the boy. There was a hesitation in his movements, as though he was fighting an internal battle between his natural instincts and an unexplainable urge to protect. Kovu stopped again, lowering his massive head. His golden mane framed his face, the early sunlight casting a regal glow over him. The boy whimpered softly, the sound barely audible over the quiet rustling of the grass. And then, Kovu took a step closer. The boy's tears glistened on his cheeks, catching the morning light as he stared at the lion. Kovu's presence was overwhelming, his size and strength radiating a power that made the child feel impossibly small. Kovu inched closer, his movements slow and deliberate. His sharp eyes scanned the boy, taking in every detail, the trembling hands, the tear-streaked face, the faint rise and fall of his small chest. He sniffed the air again, his nose wrinkling as he processed the unfamiliar scent. The lion circled him, his massive paws kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. His head tilted slightly, his gaze unwavering. The boy sat frozen, his back straight, his tiny fingers gripping his knees. His wide eyes followed Kovu's every move, but he dared not make a sound. Kovu's body language began to shift. The tension in his shoulders eased, and his tail moved in slower, more measured swishes. He lowered his head, his sharp teeth partially exposed as he sniffed closer to the ground. There was no aggression in his posture, only curiosity and something deeper, something protective. The boy flinched as Kovu stopped directly in front of him. The lion's large amber eyes seemed to soften, the predatory gleam replaced by an almost gentle intensity. Kovu tilted his head, as though trying to understand the strange creature before him. The boy's lower lip quivered, but he didn't cry. His wide eyes searched Kovu's face, desperate to decipher the lion's intent. The child's vulnerability hung heavy in the air, a silent plea that seemed to reach Kovu on a primal level. The lion moved closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over the boy. He sniffed once, the sound loud and deep, before sitting back on his haunches. For a moment, the wilderness fell silent. Kovu stared at the boy, his amber eyes filled with a peculiar warmth. He raised his head slightly, the sun catching the golden tips of his mane. His tail curled around his paws, his body language calm yet alert. The boy, sensing the change, reached out a tentative hand, his small fingers trembling. Kovu didn't move, allowing the boy to come as close as his fear would let him. And then, as the boy's fingers brushed the edge of his mane, Kovu let out a low, rumbling sigh. It wasn't a growl or a roar, but a sound of acceptance, as though he had made his decision. The king of the ridge had chosen to protect. Kovu stretched his massive body out on the dusty road, his golden mane fanning around his face like a regal crown. He lay a few feet away from the boy, his powerful frame relaxed, but his eyes sharp and alert. The child sniffled softly, his tears slowing as he watched the lion. There was something in Kovu's stillness that seemed to calm the boy. It was as if the lion, despite his fierce appearance, exuded a quiet assurance. "You're safe now." The boy rubbed his eyes with tiny fists, his body still trembling from exhaustion and fear. But the presence of the lion, so imposing yet strangely comforting, began to soothe him. Slowly, cautiously, the boy's hand stretched out toward Kovu. His fingers wavered in the air, just inches away from the lion's mane. Kovu didn't move. His eyes flicked toward the boy's hand, but he remained still, allowing the child to come as close as his courage would let him. The boy hesitated, his small fingers hovering in the space between them. And then, with a burst of bravery, he gently touched the edge of Kovu's mane. The lion's fur was soft beneath the boy's fingertips, and he let out a small gasp of wonder. For a moment, the child forgot his fear, lost in the tactile sensation of the lion's coat. Kovu huffed softly, a low, rumbling sound that wasn't threatening, but seemed almost like approval. The boy pulled his hand back quickly, as if startled by his own boldness. He looked up at Kovu, who now rested his massive head on his paws, his amber eyes still fixed on the boy. The two sat there in silence, a fragile bond forming between them. Kovu's tail flicked lazily, a subtle movement that betrayed his readiness to spring into action if necessary. The child, reassured by the lion's calm demeanor, leaned back on his heels and let out a shaky breath. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, warming the savannah, Kovu's mind drifted back to a time when he too had been small and vulnerable. Kovu had been just a cub when it happened. His pride had roamed the northern edge of the reserve, a sprawling territory that bordered human settlements. Poachers had always been a threat, but the pride's sheer size had often kept them at bay. One fateful night, however, the balance of power shifted. Kovu's mother, a fierce and protective lioness, had gone to the edge of the territory to hunt. She never returned. The next morning, her body was found near the poacher's camp, her golden fur marred by bullet wounds. Kovu had been too young to understand. He remembered sniffing her lifeless form, nudging her with his tiny nose, willing her to wake up. He had stayed there for hours, his small body curled against hers, until the sound of footsteps broke the silence. That was when Lucas appeared. The ranger, barely out of his teens, had stumbled upon the gruesome scene during a routine patrol. His heart ached at the sight of the tiny cub nestled against his mother. Carefully he approached, speaking softly to avoid startling the young lion. "It's okay, little guy," Lucas murmured, crouching down to meet Kovu's gaze. "I'm going to take care of you." Kovu had been too weak to resist. Lucas scooped him up gently, cradling him against his chest as he carried him back to the reserve's rehabilitation center. Now, as Kovu lay watching the boy, the memory lingered in his mind. He had been saved once, his life spared by the compassion of a human. Perhaps that was why he felt an inexplicable pull to protect this child. The boy yawned, his tiny body leaning sideways as fatigue overtook him. Kovu remained motionless, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. He was no longer just a lion, he was a guardian. Lucas never intended to raise a lion. At 20 years old, he was still finding his footing as a ranger at the reserve. But when he found Kovu, everything changed. The cub had been malnourished and weak, his small body trembling as Lucas carried him to the rehabilitation center. The team there specialized in rescuing injured or orphaned animals, but raising a lion cub presented unique challenges. Lucas took on the responsibility with determination. He woke up every 2 hours to feed Kovu, preparing special milk mixtures to ensure the cub received the nutrients he needed. During the day, he carried Kovu in a sling as he went about his duties, the tiny lion nestled against his chest. The bond they formed was undeniable. Kovu would follow Lucas everywhere, his tiny paws padding after the ranger like a shadow. Lucas often laughed at how the cub insisted on climbing into his lap, oblivious to the fact that he was growing bigger every day. As Kovu grew, Lucas knew he couldn't keep him forever. Lions were wild animals, and the longer Kovu stayed with humans, the harder it would be to reintegrate him into the wild. It was a painful realization, but Lucas was determined to do what was best for the lion. When the time came, Lucas worked tirelessly to introduce Kovu to a pride within the reserve. It wasn't easy. Male lions were often seen as threats to established groups. But with patience and careful planning, Lucas found a pride with a nurturing lioness who had recently given birth. The lioness, though initially wary, eventually accepted Kovu. Lucas watched from a distance as the cub began to adapt to life in the wild. It was bittersweet, knowing he could no longer be part of Kovu's everyday life, but he took comfort in seeing the lion thrive. Years passed, and Kovu grew into a powerful male, carving out his own territory within the reserve. Though he was now wild, he never forgot Lucas. On rare occasions, the lion would approach the ranger, his golden eyes holding a flicker of recognition. Lucas often wondered if Kovu's time with humans had left a lasting imprint on him. Now, seeing the lion's protective behavior toward the boy, he began to understand just how deep that bond ran. Kovu wasn't just any lion. He was a survivor, a protector, and a reminder of the extraordinary connection that could exist between man and beast. Kovu's ears twitched as a faint sound broke through the stillness of the savannah. His golden eyes shifted from the boy to the horizon, his nose wrinkling as he sniffed the air. Something was wrong. The child, still drowsy and slumped in the dirt, remained oblivious, but Kovu's entire demeanor changed. The lion stood abruptly, his muscles taut and his mane bristling. His gaze scanned the open landscape, his sharp senses honing in on a threat he could neither see nor ignore. A low growl rumbled in his chest, reverberating through the ground beneath him. The boy stirred at the sound, his tiny head lifting to look at Kovu. Though he didn't understand what was happening, he sensed the shift in the lion's posture. Fear flickered across the child's face as he watched Kovu now towering over him with a fierce intensity. Then it came, a distant guttural roar that sent a shiver through the air. Kovu growled louder, his amber eyes narrowing as he positioned himself between the boy and the source of the sound. The rival lion's call was a challenge, a declaration of its presence and intent. The boy whimpered softly, clutching at the edge of his jacket. Kovu glanced back briefly, his expression calm but resolute. It was as if the lion was silently reassuring the child. "Stay where you are. I'll handle this." The sound of paw steps grew closer, heavy and deliberate. The rival lion emerged from the tall grass, its tawny coat streaked with scars, and its piercing eyes locked onto Kovu. The newcomer was leaner but wiry, its gait confident and predatory. Kovu let out a warning roar, his powerful voice echoing across the savannah. His hackles rose, and his body lowered slightly into a defensive stance. The rival lion snarled in response, stepping closer, its lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth. The boy shrank back, his small hands clutching the dirt as he watched the two lions face off. Kovu's protective instincts flared like wildfire, his gaze flickering briefly toward the child. He couldn't retreat. This was his territory, his responsibility, and now his charge to protect. The rival lion growled again, taking another step forward. Its eyes darted briefly toward the boy, and that was all it took for Kovu to act. With a thunderous roar, Kovu lunged forward, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. The clash of the two lions was ferocious. Kovu slammed into the rival with the force of a freight train, his powerful paws swiping at the intruder's chest. Dust erupted around them as they grappled, their roars filling the air like rolling thunder. The boy sat frozen, his eyes wide with both terror and awe. He clutched his knees to his chest, watching as the two lions tumbled across the road, their claws and teeth flashing in the sunlight. Kovu fought with the fury of a protector. His massive jaws snapped dangerously close to the rival lion's throat, his mane whipping around him as he moved with precision and power. The rival lion, though smaller, was agile and cunning, dodging some of Kovu's blows and retaliating with sharp strikes of its own. The savannah seemed to hold its breath as the battle raged on. Dust clouds swirled around the combatants, obscuring the boy's view at times, but the sounds, snarls, growls, and the thudding of heavy bodies, were impossible to ignore. Kovu roared again, his voice a commanding force that sent birds scattering from nearby trees. He reared up on his hind legs, towering over the rival lion before slamming down with all his weight. The impact knocked the intruder back, but it wasn't enough to end the fight. The rival lion lunged, its teeth grazing Kovu's shoulder. The boy gasped, his small hands covering his mouth as he saw the glint of blood on Kovu's golden fur. But Kovu didn't falter. With a swift and brutal swipe, he struck the rival across the muzzle, sending it stumbling. Seizing the moment, Kovu pressed forward, his jaws snapping dangerously close to the other lion's neck. The rival let out a sharp yelp, its bravado crumbling under Kovu's relentless attack. It tried to retaliate, but Kovu's size and strength proved too much. Finally, with one last roar, Kovu charged, his sheer force driving the rival lion away. The intruder retreated, limping back into the tall grass with a low, defeated growl. Kovu stood his ground, his body heaving as he watched the other lion disappear into the distance. His mane was disheveled, his shoulder marked by a shallow wound, but his presence remained commanding and unyielding. The boy stared in stunned silence as Kovu turned back to him. For a moment, the lion stood still, his amber eyes softening as he assessed the child. Then, with a low huff, Kovu approached, his movements slow and deliberate. The lion lowered himself to the ground beside the boy, his massive body forming a protective barrier. The boy reached out tentatively, his tiny fingers brushing against Kovu's mane. "Roar," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Kovu let out a soft rumble, a sound that wasn't a roar but carried a sense of reassurance. The battle was over, the threat gone, and Kovu had proven himself once again as the boy's silent guardian. As the dust settled and the savannah returned to its quiet rhythm, the bond between lion and child deepened, forged in the fire of danger and trust. Kovu lay beside the boy, his golden mane catching the afternoon light, and together they waited for what came next. Lucas adjusted his binoculars, scanning the edge of the reserve as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The morning patrol had been uneventful so far, just another routine sweep to check the boundaries and ensure the wildlife was safe from any potential threats. But as the static crackle of his radio broke the silence, everything changed. "Lucas, we've got a report," came the voice of one of his fellow rangers. "A local spotted what looked like a child near the northern boundary of the reserve." Lucas's heart skipped a beat. "A child, are you sure?" "Positive. They were seen sitting near the main road that cuts through the reserve. No adults in sight. We're not sure how they got there." Lucas didn't waste another second. Grabbing his radio, he responded, "I'm closest to the northern boundary. I'll head there now. Keep me updated if you hear anything else." He climbed into his jeep, his mind racing. A child left alone in the reserve was a disaster waiting to happen. The savannah was no place for an unprotected human, let alone a young child. Predators roamed freely, including lions, hyenas, and leopards. Lucas pressed down on the accelerator, the jeep bouncing over the uneven terrain as he made his way toward the northern boundary. His thoughts turned to the logistics of how a child could have ended up in such a dangerous place. The reserve was vast, its boundaries patrolled and fenced in strategic areas. Had someone brought the child there deliberately? The idea made his stomach twist. As he drove, his gaze flicked to the ridge in the distance. His connection to the land and its inhabitants was deeply personal, and one inhabitant in particular came to mind: Kovu. Kovu had been a part of Lucas's life for years, a lion he had rescued as a cub and watched grow into a magnificent, solitary male. Though Kovu now lived independently in the wild, Lucas had always felt a lingering bond with the animal. He often thought of the lion as both a success story and a symbol of his life's work. But today, his thoughts weren't on Kovu. They were on the child. The image of a small, defenseless figure surrounded by the dangers of the reserve was enough to make his chest tighten. As the jeep neared the northern road, Lucas slowed down, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The vast expanse of the savannah stretched out before him, golden grasses swaying in the breeze. He spotted tracks in the dirt, small and unmistakably human. "Hold on, kid," he muttered under his breath. "I'm coming." Lucas's jeep crested a small hill, and he brought it to an abrupt stop, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the middle of the road, sat a young boy, his small figure dwarfed by the presence of an enormous lion. It took Lucas a moment to fully process what he was seeing. The boy, no older than 3, was seated on the ground, his tiny hands clutching his knees. Beside him, Kovu lay sprawled in the dirt, his massive body forming a protective shield. The lion's golden mane glinted in the sunlight, and his amber eyes were fixed on Lucas. For a moment, Lucas couldn't move. The sight was both surreal and terrifying. His instincts screamed at him to act, but he knew better than to make any sudden movements. Kovu, despite his bond with humans, was still a wild predator. "Kovu," Lucas said softly, his voice steady but low. The lion's ears twitched, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. It wasn't a threatening sound, but it was enough to make Lucas tread carefully. Kovu's gaze shifted to the boy, then back to Lucas, as if assessing whether the ranger was a threat to the child. Lucas stepped out of the jeep slowly, his hands visible and his movements deliberate. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured, his tone calm and soothing. "I'm here to help." Kovu's growl faded into silence, but he didn't move. His massive head rested on his paws, his eyes sharp and watchful. The boy, seemingly unfazed by the lion's growl, turned his head to look at Lucas. "Hey there, little guy," Lucas said gently, kneeling down a few feet away. "You okay?" The boy didn't respond, his wide eyes darting between Lucas and Kovu. He looked exhausted, his cheeks stained with dried tears. Kovu huffed softly, a sound that Lucas recognized as a sign of approval. The lion stretched his body, his powerful muscles rippling under his tawny coat, and slowly rose to his feet. Lucas held his breath, watching as Kovu took a few steps forward. The lion's movements were deliberate, almost as if he were testing Lucas's trustworthiness. Finally, Kovu stopped and sat down, his body no longer blocking the boy but still close enough to intervene if necessary. "Good boy," Lucas said quietly, his voice tinged with relief. The ranger edged closer to the child, his heart pounding. He could see the boy's tiny chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. Reaching out carefully, Lucas placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're safe now," he whispered. The boy leaned into Lucas's touch, his small body sagging with exhaustion. Lucas scooped him up gently, holding him close. The boy clung to him, his fingers curling into the fabric of Lucas's shirt. Kovu watched the entire exchange, his expression calm but vigilant. Lucas glanced at the lion, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken understanding. "Thank you," Lucas said softly, his words meant for Kovu. The lion let out a low rumble, turning his head toward the horizon. With a regal stretch, he stood and began to walk away, his golden mane swaying with each step. Lucas carried the boy back to the jeep, his mind racing with questions. How had the child ended up here? And what had compelled Kovu, a wild predator, to protect him? As Lucas placed the boy in the passenger seat and buckled him in, he cast one last glance at Kovu's retreating form. The lion paused at the edge of the grass, turning his head to look back. Lucas gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the lion's extraordinary act. "Let's get you home," he murmured to the boy, starting the engine. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a story that would change both his life and Kovu's forever. Lucas knelt cautiously on the dusty road, the boy's fragile form within arm's reach. Every move he made was deliberate, his years of experience with wild animals guiding his actions. Kovu stood a few feet away, his golden eyes watching Lucas with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "It's okay," Lucas murmured, his voice steady but soft. "I'm just going to help him." The boy stirred, his small face glancing up at Lucas before looking back at Kovu. There was a flicker of trust in the child's tear-streaked eyes, as though he instinctively understood that Lucas was there to protect him. Kovu's massive body shifted slightly, and Lucas froze, waiting to see what the lion would do. But instead of approaching or growling, Kovu sat back on his haunches, his posture regal yet relaxed. His tail swished lazily behind him, a signal that he was assessing the situation but had no intention of intervening, at least not yet. Lucas took a deep breath and reached out, his hands steady. "Hey there, buddy," he whispered to the boy, his voice filled with warmth. "You're safe now." The child didn't resist as Lucas gently lifted him into his arms. His small frame was lighter than Lucas had expected, and the boy immediately buried his face into the ranger's chest. His tiny hands clung to the fabric of Lucas's jacket, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. As Lucas stood, Kovu remained still, his watchful eyes never leaving the boy. Lucas turned slowly, mindful of the lion's presence. Good boy, Kovu, he murmured, hoping the familiar tone of his voice would reassure the lion. Kovu let out a soft huff, his breath visible in the cool morning air. His gaze shifted briefly to the horizon before returning to Lucas and the child. It was as if Kovu was silently communicating. Go now. I'll stay here. The boy, his energy completely drained, let out a small whimper before his breathing evened out into the steady rhythm of sleep. His small hand remained curled into Lucas's jacket, clutching it as though it was the only tether to safety he had. Let's get you somewhere safe, Lucas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As he stepped toward the jeep, he glanced back at Kovu one last time. The lion stood motionless, his powerful frame silhouetted against the rising sun. Their eyes met, and Lucas felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Thank you, he said quietly. Kovu didn't move. He simply watched as Lucas carried the boy to the jeep and placed him carefully in the passenger seat. The child stirred briefly, his small head resting against the back of the seat, before falling into a deeper sleep. Lucas started the engine and began the drive back to the ranger station, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions. Who was this boy? How had he ended up in the reserve? And what had compelled Kovu, a solitary predator, to protect him? As the jeep rumbled down the dirt road, Lucas glanced in the rearview mirror. Kovu was still there, standing at the edge of the road, his golden mane catching the morning light. The ranger station buzzed with activity as Lucas arrived, the boy still cradled in his arms. His team, a close-knit group of wildlife experts, rushed to meet him, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "Lucas, what happened?" one of the rangers, Mia, asked as she hurried to his side. "Found him near the northern boundary," Lucas replied, his voice grim. "He was with Kovu." "Kovu?" Mia's eyes widened in disbelief. Lucas nodded, carefully placing the boy on a makeshift cot in the station's infirmary. The child stirred slightly, his small hand reaching out instinctively until it found the sleeve of Lucas's jacket. "He's exhausted," Lucas said, his tone softening as he adjusted a blanket over the boy. "But he's okay. I don't think he's hurt." Mia crouched beside the cot, her gaze full of sympathy. "How did he end up out there?" "I don't know," Lucas admitted, "but we need to find out." The team worked quickly, offering the boy water and a small piece of bread to nibble on. He accepted them with timid hands, his wide eyes darting around the room. Though his fear was evident, there was a flicker of trust whenever his gaze landed on Lucas. "What's your name, buddy?" Lucas asked gently, kneeling beside the cot. The boy hesitated, his tiny voice barely audible. "David," he murmured. "That's a strong name," Lucas said with a smile. "Can you tell me where your mama is?" At the mention of his mother, David's face crumpled. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he clutched Lucas's sleeve tightly. "Mama," he whispered, his voice breaking. Lucas's chest tightened. He exchanged a glance with Mia, who shook her head sadly. "It's okay," Lucas said, his voice soothing. "You don't have to say anything right now. You're safe here, David. We'll figure this out together." As the boy drifted off to sleep, Lucas stood and stepped into the adjoining office, where the team had begun reviewing the reserve's surveillance footage. "We found something," Mia said, pointing to the screen. The grainy footage showed an old car stopping near the reserve's northern boundary. A woman emerged carrying a small child. After a brief struggle with the fence, she placed the boy on the dirt road, kissed his forehead, and returned to the car. Lucas watched in stunned silence as the car disappeared from view, leaving the boy alone in the wilderness. "She left him there on purpose," Mia said softly, her voice heavy with emotion. Lucas nodded, his jaw tightening. But why? Why leave him there, of all places? There were no answers, only more questions, and as Lucas looked back toward the sleeping boy, he felt an unshakable determination rise within him. Whatever had led David to the reserve, one thing was clear: Lucas wouldn't rest until he found the truth. Lucas stood in the dimly lit surveillance room, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as he watched the grainy footage on the screen. The video had been captured by a motion-activated camera near the reserve's northern boundary, and every second of it sent a fresh wave of emotions crashing over him. The footage began with the arrival of an old, battered car. Its tires kicked up a plume of dust as it came to an abrupt stop. A young woman stepped out, clutching a small boy in her arms. She looked around nervously, her movements hurried and frantic, as though she feared someone might see her. Lucas's heart tightened as he watched her approach the fence, struggling with the weak spot in the wire that had yet to be reinforced. The boy, now identifiable as David, clung to her, his small hands gripping her sweater. The woman paused, her chest heaving with deep breaths, before kneeling and placing the boy on the ground. Her hands lingered on his tiny shoulders, her head bowed as if offering a silent prayer. Then came the moment that made Lucas's chest ache. The woman leaned down and kissed David's forehead, her trembling hand brushing his hair. Her lips moved, though there was no sound. She seemed to say something, words meant only for the boy, before stepping away. David reached out for her, his tiny arms stretching as far as they could. But she didn't look back. She climbed into the car, her face obscured by the shadows, and drove away, the tail lights fading into the distance. Lucas's knuckles turned white as he gripped the desk harder. Anger flared within him at the thought of a mother abandoning her child in such a dangerous place. But as the video replayed, his emotions shifted. The way she kissed David, the hesitation in her movements, this wasn't the action of someone who didn't care. This was desperation, plain and raw. She didn't want to leave him, Mia said softly, standing beside him. Her voice was filled with the same mix of sadness and confusion that Lucas felt. "I know," Lucas replied, his voice low. "But why here? Why in the middle of the reserve?" Mia shook her head, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Maybe she thought someone would find him quickly. Maybe she thought we'd take care of him." Lucas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "It doesn't make it right. She put him at risk, left him in a place full of predators." "But he survived," Mia said, her tone taking on a note of wonder. "Because of Kovu." The mention of Kovu brought a fresh wave of gratitude to Lucas's thoughts. The lion's actions had saved the boy, and Lucas couldn't help but marvel at the bond that seemed to connect the two. "We need to find her," Lucas said, his voice resolute. "She's out there somewhere, and we need to understand why she did this." Mia nodded, but her expression was doubtful. "It's been hours. She might be long gone." "Then we'll start with what we have," Lucas replied firmly, gesturing to the screen. "We'll track the car, follow her trail. She left him for a reason, and I need to know what it is." As the footage replayed once more, Lucas's gaze lingered on the boy's tear-streaked face. The desperation in his mother's actions mirrored something Lucas had seen before, something that struck deeper than he wanted to admit. The rhythmic crunch of Lucas's boots on the gravel path was the only sound as he walked back to the station. The boy was safe for now, sleeping in the infirmary. But Lucas couldn't shake the weight of the day's events. His thoughts drifted to Kovu, the lion whose actions had defied every expectation. He couldn't understand how or why Kovu had chosen to protect the boy, but deep down, Lucas knew it wasn't random. As he reached the station's main building, Lucas spotted a familiar figure in the distance. Kovu stood atop a small ridge overlooking the station, his silhouette bathed in the warm hues of the setting sun. The lion didn't move, his amber eyes fixed on the building as though he was still watching over the boy. A faint smile touched Lucas's lips as he remembered the first time he'd met Kovu. The cub had been no bigger than a house cat, trembling and alone beside his mother's lifeless body. Lucas had acted on instinct, scooping up the tiny lion and cradling him against his chest. In the months that followed, Lucas had poured every ounce of care and patience into raising Kovu. The cub had been both a challenge and a joy, his playful antics bringing light to even the darkest days. Lucas had fed him, nursed him through illness, and taught him how to hunt. But what stood out most was the bond they had formed, a connection that went beyond words. Kovu had trusted Lucas completely, often curling up beside him at night, seeking warmth and comfort. When the time came to release Kovu back into the wild, Lucas had struggled. He knew it was the right thing to do, but the thought of letting go was almost unbearable. Yet, even after Kovu had established himself as a dominant male in the reserve, there were moments when he would appear near the station, as if to remind Lucas that their bond hadn't been broken. Now, watching Kovu linger near the station, Lucas felt a deep sense of pride. The lion wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. And somehow, that same lion had chosen to protect a human child, mirroring the care Lucas had once shown him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lucas made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he would find the answers David needed. Just as he had done for Kovu, he would be there for the boy. And maybe, just maybe, Kovu's actions were a reminder that even in the wildest of places, compassion and connection could bridge the gap between worlds. The night descended quickly over the reserve, the stars blanketing the sky in a dazzling display. The ranger station was quiet, the occasional hum of insects and distant calls of nocturnal animals, the only sounds breaking the stillness. Inside the station, Lucas sat at the small kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee as his mind raced with questions about the boy. David, now asleep in the infirmary, had begun to settle in, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the child's story was far from over. Outside, a low growl broke the silence. Lucas stiffened, his hand pausing midair. He knew that sound well. It was Kovu. Rising from his seat, Lucas made his way to the window, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. The lion's silhouette was unmistakable, standing tall near the station's perimeter. Another sound followed, a high-pitched laugh that sent a shiver down Lucas's spine. A hyena. Lucas grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside cautiously. The hyena's shadowy figure appeared near the edge of the fence, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight as it prowled closer. Kovu let out a thunderous roar, the sound reverberating through the air. The hyena froze, its posture shifting from predatory to defensive. Kovu advanced, his powerful frame exuding dominance. The hyena hesitated for a moment longer, before retreating into the night, its shape swallowed by the shadows. Lucas exhaled, relief flooding his chest. He turned his flashlight toward Kovu, who now stood motionless, his amber eyes locked onto Lucas. "Still watching over him, huh?" Lucas said softly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Kovu huffed, his breath visible in the cool night air. The lion's presence was unwavering, his gaze shifting briefly toward the infirmary before returning to Lucas. Lucas felt a swell of gratitude and respect. Kovu wasn't just a wild animal, he was a guardian. Somehow he had taken on the responsibility of protecting the boy, as if he understood the child's vulnerability. "Thank you," Lucas murmured. Kovu's tail swished lazily, a gesture that seemed almost dismissive, before he turned and padded off into the darkness. As Lucas stepped back inside, he couldn't help but feel that the lion's actions were more than instinct. There was a purpose to Kovu's presence, a connection that defied explanation. Morning sunlight streamed through the infirmary window, casting a warm glow over the small cot where David lay. Lucas sat beside him, his hand resting gently on the boy's back. The child stirred, his small face scrunching as he opened his eyes. "Morning, buddy," Lucas said softly, his voice filled with warmth. David blinked sleepily before offering a shy smile. He reached out, his tiny fingers brushing against Lucas's sleeve. Lucas's heart ached with a mix of emotions. The boy's trust was palpable, a fragile yet beautiful bond that had grown in the days since Lucas had found him. As Lucas helped David sit up, Mia entered the room with a bowl of oatmeal. "Someone's looking better today," she said with a smile, placing the bowl on the table. David looked at Mia, then back at Lucas. His small hands clutched at Lucas's arm as he opened his mouth. "Dada," he whispered. The word hung in the air like a beacon, startling both Lucas and Mia. Lucas froze, his eyes widening. "What did you say?" David repeated the word, his voice a little stronger this time. "Dada." Mia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes glistening. "Oh, Lucas." Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected this, and yet in that moment it felt right. David had chosen him, trusted him, and now called him something that carried immense weight. Swallowing hard, Lucas reached out and ruffled the boy's hair. "You've got good taste, kid," he said with a chuckle, though his voice was thick with emotion. Mia smiled through her tears. "I think we need to give him a name. David is fine, but after everything with Kovu, maybe something inspired by him." Lucas considered her words, glancing out the window where Kovu often lingered. "Leo," he said finally. "It's simple, but it suits him, and it's a reminder of the lion who saved him." Mia nodded. "Leo it is." David, now Leo, smiled, his small fingers reaching up to touch Lucas's face. Lucas felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. Kovu's actions had set something extraordinary in motion, and now, with Leo by his side, Lucas felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days following Leo's rescue were a whirlwind of activity at the ranger station. Lucas contacted every authority he could think of: child welfare services, local law enforcement, and even neighboring villages. Flyers were distributed, descriptions of Leo were shared, and the grainy surveillance footage of the woman leaving him at the reserve boundary was analyzed again and again. But as days turned into weeks, the responses all came back the same. No missing child reports matched Leo's description. No one seemed to be searching for a boy of his age. Lucas sat at his desk late one evening, his head resting in his hands. The ranger station, usually filled with the sounds of radio chatter and wildlife calls, felt eerily quiet. The weight of the situation bore down on him. "Still no leads?" Mia's voice broke through the silence. Lucas looked up, his tired eyes meeting hers. He shook his head. "Nothing. It's like he doesn't exist." Mia sighed and sat across from him, her expression soft with concern. Maybe it's time to accept that no one's coming for him. The words hit Lucas harder than he expected. He glanced toward the infirmary, where Leo was sound asleep under a blanket that seemed far too big for his tiny frame. Over the weeks, the boy had begun to flourish under their care. His shy demeanor had softened, replaced by a quiet curiosity about the world around him. He followed Lucas everywhere, his tiny hand often clutching the rangers as they walked the reserve grounds. "He's starting to trust me," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't let him down now." "You haven't," Mia reassured him. "You've given him more love and security in these weeks than he might have had in his entire life." Lucas nodded, but a pang of guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't help but think of the woman from the footage. What had driven her to leave Leo in such a dangerous place? That night, as Lucas sat by Leo's bedside, the boy stirred and opened his eyes. "Dada?" he murmured sleepily, reaching out for Lucas. Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat as he took Leo's small hand. "I'm here, buddy," he said softly. In that moment, the heartbreaking reality set in. Leo might truly be an orphan, and if no one else would claim him, Lucas knew he would. The idea of adopting Leo crept into Lucas's mind slowly, but once it took root, it refused to leave. As the days passed, he found himself imagining what life would be like with the boy as part of his family. One afternoon, as Leo sat on Lucas's lap while they reviewed maps of the reserve, the thought struck him with full force. "I've already started thinking of him as my own." The realization brought a flood of emotions. Lucas's mind raced with memories of raising Kovu, of the bond they had formed during those early, uncertain days. The parallels between Kovu and Leo were undeniable. Both had been vulnerable and alone, abandoned by circumstances beyond their control. Both had found their way to Lucas, seeking safety and care. That evening, Lucas gathered his team in the station's common room. Mia, along with the other rangers, listened as he spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been thinking about Leo," Lucas began. "We've done everything we can to find his family, but it doesn't look like anyone's coming for him. I can't send him to an orphanage. I won't. He's already been through enough." Mia smiled gently. "So, what are you saying?" "I want to adopt him," Lucas said firmly. "I know it's not what I planned for my life, but I can't ignore this. He needs someone, and I think that someone is me." The room fell silent for a moment before one of the rangers, a burly man named Greg, clapped Lucas on the shoulder. "You've got our support, boss," he said with a grin. "Leo couldn't ask for a better dad." Mia nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've already proven you can do this. Look at Kovu. You raised a lion, Lucas. A human kid will be a piece of cake." Laughter rippled through the room, lightening the heavy atmosphere. Lucas felt a wave of gratitude for his team's unwavering support. The decision wasn't easy, but it felt right. Later that night, as Lucas tucked Leo into bed, he whispered, "I'm not going anywhere, little guy. You're stuck with me now." Leo's sleepy smile was all the confirmation Lucas needed. The boy had chosen him, and Lucas had chosen the boy. Together they were building a new family, one born of unexpected circumstances but bound by love and trust. And just outside the station, under the watchful gaze of the stars, Kovu lingered. The lion's golden eyes reflected the light, a silent reminder of the bond that had brought them all together. The process to adopt Leo was both a bureaucratic challenge and an emotional journey, but Lucas approached it with unwavering determination. Every form he filled out, every background check he completed, felt like a step closer to giving Leo the life he deserved. His team rallied around him, providing support and helping where they could. Weeks turned into months, and during that time, the bond between Lucas and Leo only grew stronger. The boy, once shy and withdrawn, began to bloom under Lucas's care. His laughter filled the ranger station, a sweet sound that lifted the spirits of everyone around. Mia often joked that Leo had become the station's unofficial mascot. "He's got all of us wrapped around his little finger," she teased one afternoon as Leo toddled through the station, carrying a map almost as big as he was. Lucas smiled, watching Leo from across the room. "He's got a way of doing that," he said warmly. Outside the station, Kovu continued to make his presence known. The lion appeared at the fence every few days, his massive frame a familiar and reassuring sight. Sometimes he would lie in the grass for hours, his golden eyes scanning the station as if ensuring Leo was safe. Lucas often found himself standing at the fence, watching Kovu. "He's still keeping watch," he'd murmur to Mia. She'd nod, her gaze soft. "It's like he knows. He's part of this story, too." When the day finally came for Lucas to sign the final adoption papers, the entire team gathered to celebrate. Leo, blissfully unaware of the significance of the moment, sat in Lucas's lap, playing with a small stuffed lion that Mia had given him. As Lucas signed his name on the last line, he glanced down at Leo, whose bright eyes were fixed on the toy. "It's official," Lucas said, his voice tinged with emotion. "You're my son now." Leo looked up, his face lighting up with a smile. "Dada," he said softly, reaching up to touch Lucas's face. The room erupted in applause and cheers, but for Lucas the only thing that mattered was the boy in his arms. Later that evening, as the celebration quieted, Lucas sat on the porch of the station with Leo asleep in his arms. In the distance, Kovu's silhouette appeared near the ridge, his golden mane glowing in the moonlight. "Thank you," Lucas whispered. his voice carrying across the cool night air. He didn't know if Kovu could understand the words, but he hoped the lion could feel the gratitude behind them. It was a bright, crisp morning when Lucas decided it was time for Leo to meet Kovu properly. The boy had seen the lion from afar, but Lucas wanted to give him the chance to understand the significance of the animal that had played such a pivotal role in his rescue. "Ready for an adventure, kiddo?" Lucas asked as he loaded Leo into the jeep. Leo clapped his hands excitedly. "Lion!" Lucas chuckled. "Yeah, buddy. We're going to see the lion." The drive through the reserve was peaceful, the golden savanna stretching out in every direction. Lucas explained to Leo how special Kovu was, sharing stories of the lion's early days and how he had saved Leo from danger. When they reached the ridge where Kovu often roamed, Lucas parked the jeep and lifted Leo into his arms. "Let's see if he's around," Lucas said, scanning the horizon. Almost on cue, Kovu appeared. The lion emerged from the tall grass, his movements slow and deliberate. His massive frame was both intimidating and awe-inspiring, but Lucas felt no fear. Kovu's gaze softened as he approached, his amber eyes flicking between Lucas and Leo. "There he is," Lucas said, his voice low and calm. "That's Kovu." Leo's eyes widened with wonder. "Lion!" he exclaimed, pointing a tiny finger toward the majestic creature. Lucas knelt down, keeping a firm hold on Leo. To his amazement, the boy showed no fear. Instead, he reached out toward Kovu, his small hand extended. Kovu paused a few feet away, sniffing the air. Then, to Lucas's astonishment, the lion stepped closer. Slowly and gently, Kovu lowered his massive head, his nose brushing against Leo's outstretched hand. Leo giggled, his fingers brushing through the coarse fur of Kovu's mane. "Soft," he said, his voice filled with delight. Lucas felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched the interaction. This was more than a moment of connection. It was a bond that transcended the boundaries of species, a reminder of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them all together. Kovu huffed softly, his warm breath ruffling Leo's hair. The boy laughed, leaning into Lucas's chest as if sharing the joy of the moment with his father. "Thank you," Lucas said again, his voice barely above a whisper. Kovu lifted his head, his regal posture returning. He stared at Lucas for a long moment, his golden eyes filled with an intelligence that Lucas could never fully comprehend. Then, with a flick of his tail, Kovu turned and padded away, disappearing into the savanna. Lucas held Leo close, his heart full. "That's a moment you'll never forget, kiddo," he murmured, pressing a kiss to Leo's forehead. As they drove back to the station, Lucas couldn't help but feel that their little family, himself, Leo, and even Kovu, was finally complete. The setting sun painted the savanna in warm hues of gold and crimson, the sky stretching wide and endless above the reserve. Lucas sat on a blanket spread over the soft grass, watching as Leo toddled around, chasing fireflies that danced in the evening light. A gentle breeze carried the familiar earthy scent of the reserve, a place that had become more than a workplace. It was home. Not far away, Kovu lay sprawled lazily, his massive form blending into the golden landscape. His golden mane shimmered in the light of the setting sun, and his ears flicked now and then, listening to the boy's delighted giggles. Lucas leaned back on his hands, letting the moment wash over him. He had spent years dedicated to protecting the animals of this reserve, never imagining that his path would lead him here, raising a child with a lion by their side. "It's funny, isn't it?" Lucas said aloud, though he knew Kovu wouldn't respond. "How life has a way of circling back." His thoughts drifted to the day he had found Kovu as a tiny cub, trembling against the lifeless body of his mother. Lucas had been younger then, filled with determination and hope, and raising Kovu had been a challenge he took on with open arms. The bond they had formed was one of trust and mutual respect, a connection that had stayed strong even as Kovu returned to the wild. And now, Leo, the boy who had been abandoned yet somehow saved by fate, or perhaps by Kovu himself. "Dada!" Leo called, his voice breaking Lucas's reverie. The boy ran toward him, clutching a handful of wildflowers in his tiny fists. "For you!" Lucas chuckled, taking the flowers and pulling Leo into his lap. "Thanks, buddy. These are beautiful." Leo squirmed excitedly, pointing toward Kovu. "Lion!" The lion lifted his head at the sound of Leo's voice, his amber eyes locking onto the boy. Kovu stretched his massive body before padding over, his steps slow and deliberate. Lucas felt no fear as Kovu approached. Over the years, the lion had proven himself time and again to be more than just a wild animal. He was family. As Kovu settled beside them, Leo reached out eagerly, his small hands grabbing at the lion's mane. Kovu huffed softly, his large head leaning into the boy's touch. "Be gentle, Leo," Lucas said with a smile, though he knew Kovu's patience was endless when it came to the boy. Leo giggled, leaning against Lucas as Kovu let out a deep, playful roar. The sound echoed across the savannah, a powerful yet comforting reminder of the bond they shared. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The man, the boy, and the lion. Three souls brought together by extraordinary circumstances, now bound by love and trust. Lucas looked out at the horizon, the sun dipping lower and casting long shadows across the grass. He felt a profound sense of peace, the kind that comes from knowing you are exactly where you're meant to be. "I think we're doing okay, kiddo," Lucas murmured, pressing a kiss to Leo's head. Leo's laughter rang out as Kovu let out another playful roar, his massive tail swishing across the ground. Lucas couldn't help but join in, his deep chuckle blending with the joyful sounds of his son and the lion who had saved them both. As the sun finally disappeared behind the distant hills, Lucas, Leo, and Kovu remained together, a family forged not by blood, but by something far deeper. Fate had brought them full circle, and in that moment, Lucas knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, man, child, and lion.